My clearance existed in the space between official records and operational necessity, the kind of authorization that made servitors pause mid-calculation and tech priests avert their augmetic eyes. I carried no rosette, wore no insignia, and answered to a department that had no building, ordo septrum. We audited discrepancies that weren't supposed to exist in systems that couldn't malfunction. The wafer arrived on my desk, without requisition stamp or delivery manifest. Obsidian black ceramic, no thicker than prayer parchment, encoded with a cipher that should have rejected every terminal on Terra except mine. The brief was surgical in its brevity: reconcile energy consumption logs between Mechanicus capacitor drawdown reports and Administratum resource ledgers for the Golden Throne complex. No theological context. No strategic justification. Just numbers that needed to match and a clearance level that suggested they wouldn't. I worked 3 levels beneath the master of the Administratum in a vault where the air tasted of recycled breath and machine oil. My cogitator terminal occupied a desk bolted to decking that hadn't seen natural light since the Unification Wars. Around me, 200 other auditors hunched over similar stations, each tracking their own fragment of the Imperium's infinite bureaucracy. We were the ones who noticed when Forge Worlds reported production that exceeded their raw material imports, when tithe fleets arrived with cargo masses that didn't match their departure manifests, when the numbers whispered that someone, somewhere, was lying to the throne. I pulled 10,000 processing cycles of maintenance logs through a clerk's slate, watching power consumption graphs scroll past in rivers of data. The Golden Throne complex drew enough energy to light a hive city, routed through capacitor arrays the size of hab blocks and distributed across systems I had no theological clearance to understand. My job wasn't to comprehend the Emperor's machinery. My job was to verify that the electricity going in matched the services coming out. The pattern emerged on the 43rd day, not a grand revelation, but a whisper of inconsistency that only someone drowning in minutia would notice. Every 88 minutes, the throne complex drew a pulse that didn't correspond to any logged function. Not life support, not biosustain, not Astronomican feed protocols. The spike lasted 3 seconds, consumed enough power to run a manufactorum district, and left no trace in any maintenance subroutine I could access. The energy simply vanished into systems labeled with clearance codes I didn't recognize. I cross-referenced the anomaly against every possible explanation. Emergency capacitor testing, backup system verification, ritual machine spirit appeasement cycles. Nothing fit. The pulse was too regular, too precise, too carefully hidden beneath layers of ordinary consumption to be accidental. Then I noticed the second pattern. Every 88 days, a custodian guard rotation ended without standard transfer protocol or death rubric. The warrior simply ceased to exist in the duty roster. No memorial, no reassignment. The records stitched themselves closed like wounds healing over scar tissue, leaving behind personnel gaps that the next shift filled without question or comment. The correlation was perfect, too perfect. Each 88-day cycle concluded with a rotation termination and a corresponding spike in the throne's energy consumption, as if the system was consuming something more than electricity. I dove deeper, requisitioning Vox archives from the Inner Palace communications network through channels so bureaucratically obscure that most auditors didn't know they existed. The archives were fragmented, redacted in layers, but the timestamps remained intact. During each 88-minute pulse, Vox traffic inside the throne chamber mirrored the energy spike with millisecond offsets. Something inside the machine was talking to something outside the machine, and the entire communications infrastructure of Terra pretended not to notice. The conversation had been happening for centuries. I spent 6 more days building a variance report through the approved channels, documenting every discrepancy with the detached precision expected of an ordo septrum auditor. No speculation, no conclusions. Just data that demanded explanation from someone with theological clearance I would never possess. The report traveled up 3 levels of Administratum hierarchy before it bounced back with a return code I'd never encountered. Null sender, null recipient, secured under a lockout protocol that didn't appear in any cipher manual I'd studied. The rejection wasn't a denial. It was an erasure, as if my query had touched something that deleted questions by reflex. That evening, I returned to my habitation cell to find my door code rejected. The biometric scanner that had recognized my palm print for 8 years now flashed red with a message, "Occupant unregistered." I logged into the Administratum network from a public terminal and searched for my own personnel file. The face staring back at me from my identification pict wasn't mine. Same name, same rank, same assignment history, but the person in the image was a stranger with different bone structure, different augmetics, a different man living my life while I stood in a corridor, becoming progressively more invisible to the Imperium's bureaucratic immune system. The next morning, I arrived at my desk to find a captain of the Adeptus Custodes standing where my chair should be. He stood perfectly still, auramite armor, catching the vault's dim lighting like captured starlight. The gold was so pure it seemed to generate its own illumination, turning his presence into a void in the room's industrial grimness. Every other auditor had found urgent business elsewhere. The vault, usually humming with the white noise of 200 cogitators processing simultaneously, had gone silent. The captain placed a slate on my desk with the careful precision of a man laying down a funeral offering. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of authority that predated the Imperium itself. Follow the route. Record nothing. Do not speak. He turned and walked away without waiting for acknowledgement, his footsteps making no sound despite the ceramite-decked boots and the armored mass that should have made the floor plating ring. By the time I picked up the slate, he had vanished into the vault's shadows, as if he'd never existed. The slate contained a single file, a map of sublevels I didn't have clearance to know existed, marked with authentication handshakes for security gates I'd never imagined passing through. No explanation, no orders. Just a route descending into the foundations of the Imperial Palace like a path into the Earth's core. I followed because the alternative was waiting for my existence to finish eroding, for someone to notice the audit trail of a dead man, asking questions about the Emperor's machinery, and decide that loose ends were best severed cleanly. The first security checkpoint opened before I reached it. A Lucifer pattern blast door 3 meters thick, designed to withstand orbital bombardment, recognized the slate's handshake and split along its central seam with a hiss of escaping pressure. Beyond, a corridor lined with sensor cherubs that tracked movement through the palace's restricted zones. They swiveled toward me as I passed, their augmetic eyes focusing, then deliberately looked away as if instructed to grant me invisibility. Servitors stood frozen at their duty stations, hymnal vocalizations dying mid-syllable. A patrol of Adepta Sororitas rounded a corner ahead, bolters held in parade rest, then pivoted in perfect unison to take an alternate route that gave me uncontested passage. Everything in the palace's security apparatus was conspiring to pretend I wasn't there. I descended through locks that opened without challenge, past checkpoints manned by palace guards who stared straight through me. The architecture changed as I went deeper. The upper levels maintained the Baroque grandeur expected of the Emperor's seat, golden aquillas, marble columns, vaulted ceilings, adorned with millennia of accumulated devotional art. Down here, the pretense of beauty gave way to function. Bare rockcrete walls, exposed conduits thick as transit tubes, the bones of the palace stripped of decorative flesh. The air grew warmer with each level, humid with the breath of massive machinery. I could feel vibration through the deck plating, a rhythm too slow to be human heartbeat, but too steady to be anything else. The pulse I'd found in the data logs translated from electrical pattern into physical sensation. The lowest door wore a Mechanicus seal. 20 litanies of interdiction etched in binaric cant around a lock mechanism that would respond only to the highest-ranking tech. Priests. It opened when I presented the blank slate, responding to authentication codes I didn't know I was carrying. Beyond lay a chamber that shouldn't exist according to any schematic of the Imperial Palace I'd ever accessed. The space stretched into darkness beyond the limits of my vision, lit by the phosphorescent glow of monitoring equipment and the pale blue shimmer of active stasis fields. A procession of Mechanicus, adepts in red robes, circled a gantry platform bolted 50 meters above the floor, their movements ritualized, their chanting a constant susurrus that filled the air like static. Beneath the gantry, a machine swallowed light. I'd seen pics of the Golden Throne's visible arrays, the Baroque magnificence of gold and platinum, reliquaries containing fragments of the emperor's personal artifacts, the throne itself rendered in art as a seat of divine majesty. This wasn't that. This was what lay beneath the ceremony. Cables thick as artillery, barrels descended from the ceiling, disappearing into a chassis of dark metal that predated imperial manufacturing standards. Predated human manufacturing standards. The geometry was wrong in ways that made my augmetic eye ache, angles that suggested dimensionality my brain refused to process. The visible golden throne sat somewhere above, all glory and pilgrimage sites. Down here, the arteries of that machine dove into something older than the palace, older than unity, old enough to make tech priests whisper prayers of placation as they maintained it. Amagos detached from the procession and gestured me forward without interrupting his cant. His mechadendrites moved in patterns that suggested he was conducting multiple conversations simultaneously, with his fellow adepts, with the machine, with something I couldn't perceive. You are the auditor. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered without curiosity or concern. He led me along the gantry's perimeter to a monitoring station where data cascaded across hololithic displays in streams, too dense for unaugmented comprehension. He didn't slow down, didn't explain, simply pointed with a steel-tipped mechadendrite at specific data columns as if I should understand their significance through osmosis. Requisitions, he said, his voice rendered metallic by vox, augmentation. Psyker biomass, indexed by tonnage, not individual count. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of tons of biological material consumed annually, processed through systems labeled with euphemisms like fuel consumption and sustain protocols. The Mechanicus didn't track people. They tracked weight, caloric value, psychic potential, measured in units I didn't recognize. Another display showed capacitor discharge curves. The energy consumption I'd been auditing rendered as geometric patterns. But here, the readings included feedback loops I'd never seen in the sanitized reports, energy flowing both into and out of the throne complex, in rhythms that suggested conversation rather than one-way consumption. A third display carried the title that made my augmetic eyes tracking stutter. Asterisk, substitution error. Acceptable. Asterisk. What's being substituted? I asked, my voice barely audible over the chanting. The Magos didn't answer immediately. His optical array focused on something behind me. I turned to find a vox caster mounted beneath the gantry railing, its grill pointed directly at our position. My handler's voice emerged from the speaker. Dead 6 years in a shuttle accident that left no bodies and closed all investigations. Dead, but speaking with the careful enunciation I'd learned to decode during our 3 years working together. Walk away. The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning. Warning, plea, last chance. Before I could respond, another voice overrode the first, deeper by orders of magnitude, modulated through the throne's infinite machinery until it seemed to emerge from the air itself rather than any single speaker. A voice that bypassed audio processing and spoke directly to the parts of my brain that understood language. Continue. The Magos resumed walking, as if divine intervention was standard operating procedure. I followed because my legs moved before my conscious mind could object. We descended from the main gantry to an annex platform I hadn't noticed from above. The space was smaller, more focused, built around a second frame that shared geometric principles with the massive chassis I'd seen but reduced to laboratory scale. The machine pulsed with its own rhythm, cables connecting it to the main stack through conduits that glowed with data transfer rates that should have melted the casing. Harmonic stabilizer, the Magos announced, as if that explained anything. The ledger he pulled up on a nearby cogitator called it something else. Asterisk mirror. Asterisk. The displays showed the stabilizer's output spiking in perfect counterphase to the main throne's energy. Consumption. Every time the 88-minute pulse hit the primary capacitors, this smaller machine replied with an equal and opposite surge, not reflection, compensation, like two singers harmonizing to create a third note that neither could produce alone. The Emperor does not sleep, the Magos said, his tone suggesting recitation of liturgy rather than explanation. He circulates. He pointed with a mechadendrite at something I'd missed in my initial assessment. Names carved into the frame's inner plate in Gothic script, so small I needed my augmetic eye's magnification to read them. Administratum officials, navigator houses, astropathic choirs, adeptus custodes, each name followed by a date, each date corresponding to an 88-day cycle terminus. The correlation clicked into place with the inevitability of a loss lock engaging. The custodians who vanished from duty rosters, the psyker biomass consumed by tonnage, the acceptable substitution errors. The machine wasn't just being maintained, it was being fed. Why does a stabilizer need names? The question emerged before I could stop it. The Magos didn't answer. Instead, he stared at my slate with his optical array recalibrating through multiple spectrum ranges, analyzing something about the device that troubled his machine-augmented perception. You carry a seal I did not authorize. The slate vibrated in my hand with a data push I hadn't requested. New text overwrote the original route. Asterisk, transit, Phobos Gate, Titan, asterisk. The authentication codes updated themselves, granting clearances I definitely shouldn't possess. Before I could object, 2 custodians emerged from shadows I could have sworn were empty seconds before. They flanked me with the inevitability of an execution detail, though neither drew weapons. One placed a sealed rosette in my hand, inquisitorial authority, though marked with cipher sigils I didn't recognize. The other spoke with the same finality the captain had used. You've seen enough of this part. They escorted me back through the levels I'd descended, but the palace felt different during the ascent. Where before it had pretended I didn't exist, now it acknowledged my passage with the careful attention reserved for hazardous materials in transit. Servitors tracked my movement. Sensor arrays focused. Palace guards maintained distance but kept visual contact, as if I'd become something that required monitoring rather than invisibility. We emerged onto a landing platform where Terra's false sky spread overhead, not the true void, but the atmospheric haze that turned the sun into a dim smear of light. The Astronomican's pulse beat against my augmetic eye, like pressure behind my temples, a rhythm I'd never consciously noticed but which now seemed overwhelming in its constancy. A Navy shuttle waited with engines already cycling, its hull bare of identification marks or unit heraldry. Anonymous. Deniable. The kind of transport that carried things the Imperium needed moved without officially acknowledging their existence. One of the custodians handed me a sealed scroll case as I reached the boarding ramp. Heavy ceramite, inscribed with wards that made my augmetic eyes targeting reticle glitch and reset. Your orders. Do not open them until you clear Terra's gravity well. The shuttle lifted before I'd properly secured my harness, acceleration pushing me back into the seat hard enough to test the shock absorption. Through the viewport, the palace receded, that impossible sprawl of architecture covering half a continent, layer upon layer of humanity's devotion rendered in stone and precious metal. Somewhere beneath all that glory, cables descended into darkness to feed a machine that consumed names on an 88-day cycle. The pilot wore a blank gorget where unit markings should be displayed, her augmetic standard Navy pattern except for the silence. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge my presence, simply flew with the precision of someone following a route so deeply ingrained it required no conscious thought. A servo skull hung from the canopy above her station, its vox grille sealed with a Mechanicus purity seal. But as we climbed through the upper atmosphere, breaking free of Terra's embrace, I watched the skull's optical sensors track toward my position and hold focus for 3 seconds before returning to neutral. Something was watching. Using the skull. Using the pilot. Using the entire infrastructure of the Imperial Navy to monitor one auditor who'd asked questions about energy consumption patterns. I opened the scroll case at the edge of Terra's gravity well, as instructed. The orders inside were written on parchment that felt organic, skin-like, inscribed in a hand so perfect it could only have been servitor-scribed. But the signature at the bottom was human, a single initial in ink that hadn't fully dried. Asterisk. Verify Titan's sub-Astronomican mirror arrays. Compare phase deltas with Terra baseline. Determine whether the harmonic stabilizer observed in Palace sub-level 9 possesses operational analogs in off-world installations. Prioritize Mechanicus facilities with direct Golden Throne maintenance responsibility. Report through Ordo Septrum channels only. Speak to no one. Trust, no confirmation. Asterisk. No congratulations for surviving my descent into the palace. No explanation for what I'd witnessed. Just new data to reconcile and a trajectory that felt like falling with extra steps. The pilot tapped her flight slate without looking at me. I leaned forward enough to see the display. Among the standard navigation data, velocity, heading, fuel consumption, a small icon pulsed in the corner. The same rhythm I'd found in the energy consumption logs. The 88-minute heartbeat of the machine we'd just left behind, transmitted to this shuttle's cogitator as if it were standard telemetry. I settled back into my seat and watched Terra shrink in the viewport. The planet that housed the Emperor's palace, that held the Astronomican source, that anchored humanity's scattered presence across the galaxy, it looked so small from here, fragile, a sphere of gray atmosphere and continental sprawl, entirely dependent on systems that consumed names and pretended not to. Mars appeared as a rust-red disk, growing larger as we adjusted our trajectory. The Forge World's orbital rings glittered with the reflected light of 1 billion manufacturing stations, each one producing materials for the Imperium's endless wars. Somewhere below that industrial exoskeleton, Mechanicus adepts maintained their own secrets, their own machines that predated human understanding. I pulled out my personal slate, not the one the Custodians had modified, but my own device carrying 8 years of audit work, and tried to file a routine status update with my department. The message failed to send. No error code, no rejection. The text simply didn't transmit, as if the act of updating my superiors on my current assignment had been classified at a level that prevented the communication from existing. I was becoming operationally invisible, still breathing, still carrying imperial authority, but erased from official channels in real time. The kind of deep cover status that preceded either critical missions or permanent disappearance. The pilot received a Vox transmission as we passed Mars's shadow. She acknowledged with a brief cant code, then adjusted our heading. I watched the navigation display update to show our new destination. Phobos Gate, the secondary anchor for Mars's orbital infrastructure. From there, we'd board a larger vessel for the journey to Titan. Titan. The moon where the Grey Knights made their fortress, where the Ordo Malleus maintained its deepest secrets, where the Emperor's chamber supposedly trained warriors to fight daemons that official doctrine claimed didn't exist. If Terra had a harmonic stabilizer hidden beneath the palace, what would it find beneath Titan's surface? The shuttle docked at Phobos Gate without ceremony. The station was a utilitarian nightmare of docking clamps and transfer tubes. All function and no aesthetics. Navy personnel moved cargo with servitor efficiency, their augmetics and work servos blurring the line between human and machine. No one acknowledged our arrival. No customs inspection. No security review. We simply docked, and the pilot gestured toward the transfer tube with the first human movement I'd seen her make. I crossed through the tube into a Navy courier vessel that made the shuttle look spacious by comparison. Courier ships were built for speed over comfort, minimal crew, maximum engine capacity, hulls stripped of everything that didn't contribute to velocity. This one had been modified further, its interior walls covered with inscriptions I recognized as high Gothic prayers against corruption, the kind of words you found on ships that carried dangerous cargo. A Navy officer with a blank uniform, no rank insignia, no unit patches, nothing to identify her beyond the fact of her existence, handed me a data slate without making eye contact. Your berth. Your schedule. Do not deviate. She was gone before I could respond, disappearing into the courier's narrow corridors like water down a drain. My berth was a coffin-sized cabin with a cot, a waste recycler, and a wall-mounted cogitator terminal. I pulled up the ship's manifest out of habit, expecting it to be locked or redacted. Instead, the data appeared freely. We were listed as a pilgrimage vessel carrying devotional supplies to Titan. The cargo manifest showed prayer scrolls, ritual implements, ecclesiastical materials. I'd seen the cargo being loaded through the viewport. Those weren't prayer scrolls. They were sealed containers with hazard markings I didn't recognize, moved with the kind of reverence usually reserved for archaeotech or extremely unstable munitions. The courier broke dock with a violence that suggested emergency departure protocols. No grace period, no gradual acceleration. The engines engaged at full thrust, and we were moving, leaving Phobos Gate behind as if something was chasing us. I strapped into the cot's restraint harness and tried to sleep. Failed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw names carved into metal. Heard that voice emerging from the throne's machinery, so deep it bypassed hearing entirely and spoke directly to comprehension. Asterisk. Continue. Asterisk. We burned toward Titan at the maximum safe velocity for a vessel our size. The journey would take 3 days at this speed, 3 days to consider what I'd learned, what I'd been ordered to find, and what happened to auditors who reconciled discrepancies that the Imperium preferred to keep unreconciled. On the second day, I received a data burst through the courier's cogitator network. Ordo Septrum, pushing orders directly to my neural implant through encryption so heavy it made my augmetic eye water. The message was brief. Asterisk. Verify Titan's resonance engines. Compare phase synchronization with Terra's primary mirror. Determine operational capacity for distributed load bearing. Assess psyker consumption rates. Report all findings. Survive. Asterisk. That last word felt like an afterthought, or a joke, or the kind of false hope you give someone before sending them into a grinder. The courier dropped out of warp at Titan's outer marker with a violence that suggested either poor navigation or intentional abruptness. Through the viewport, Saturn's largest moon looked like a ball of tarnished silver, its surface invisible beneath atmospheric haze and whatever wards the Grey Knights maintained to keep unwanted attention away. We received clearance to dock from a Vox operator whose voice carried harmonics that suggested heavy augmentation or psychic conditioning. The codes the pilot transmitted in response made the courier's cogitator stutter and reset, as if the authentication protocols carried weight beyond mere data. Titan's orbital defenses tracked us all the way in. I could feel the targeting locks like pressure against my skin, weapon systems maintained by warriors who'd spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing things that shouldn't exist. The courier berthed at a dock with no identification number, no traffic patterns, no indication that this anchorage point officially existed. Grey Knights in full battle plate supervised our arrival, their presence turning the docking bay into a space where violence felt inevitable rather than possible. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. Standing near them was like standing near a fusion reactor, aware of the barely contained energy, the certainty that one wrong move would result in immediate and absolute erasure. A Grey Knight chaplain approached as I descended the boarding ramp. His armor was covered in inscriptions I couldn't read, prayers written in languages that predated the Imperium and probably shouldn't be spoken by human throats. He looked at me for 3 full seconds, his gaze penetrating in ways that had nothing to do with eyes. "You carry the weight already," he said. Not an accusation, an observation. Before I could ask what weight he meant, he turned and walked away, his steps making the deck plating ring with the deep toll of Terminator armor. I was left standing on Titan's docking bay, watching the courier depart without ceremony, carrying cargo I hadn't seen unloaded to destinations I wouldn't be told about. An Ordo Malleus functionary appeared from the shadows. They had a lot of shadows on Titan, even in well-lit spaces, as if darkness was attracted to the moon by virtue of what the knights did here. She wore robes that had once been white but had been stained by exposure to things that left metaphysical rather than chemical residue. "Welcome to Titan," she said with the enthusiasm of someone welcoming you to your execution. "The quartermaster is expecting you." She led me, through corridors that twisted in ways architecture shouldn't allow, past chambers where I heard chanting that made my augmetic eye glitch and display error codes that looked like prayers. We descended. Everything in the Imperium's secret places seemed to involve descent, until we reached a vault sealed with warding so dense the air itself seemed reluctant to pass through the threshold. The quartermaster waited inside. A Grey Knight stripped of armor, wearing robes marked with cipher sigils that suggested he'd transcended normal rank structures and become something else. He gestured at a slate on the chamber's single table. "Your mission. Speak it in numbers only." I recited the orders as I'd received them, translating objectives into data points and metrics. He repeated my words back perfectly, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested his brain had been modified to process and store information with cogitator precision. When I finished, he picked up the slate and dropped it into a brazier where flames burned without fuel. The device didn't catch fire. It simply ceased existing, matter converting to nothing, in a way that violated several principles of physics I'd believed were immutable. He returned my rosette. The seal felt heavier than when I'd received it on Terra, as if authority gained mass through proximity to whatever Titan contained. "Follow me," he said. "You need to see what you're auditing before you can understand what the numbers mean." We descended further still, past chambers where gray knights trained against opponents I couldn't see, but whose presence made the air ripple with barely contained violence. Past libraries where codices were chained to lecterns not to prevent theft but to prevent the books from opening themselves. Past meditation cells where warriors knelt in perfect stillness, their minds fighting battles in spaces that weren't physical. The lowest level didn't feel like a vault. It felt like a cathedral built in negative space, carved from Titan's bedrock and lined with machinery that predated human colony. At the chamber's center stood a machine that was the Golden Throne's smaller twin. Same impossible geometry, same cables descending from darkness above, same sense that looking at it too long would teach you things that couldn't be unlearned. The Grey Knights called it a resonance engine. Their chaplain stood beside it unhelmed, his scarred face marked with litanies that had been carved rather than tattooed. He saw me approach and began reciting an oath I'd never heard before. Each word carefully enunciated. "We are not the light. We are burned by it. We stand in flames not our own, and we serve a radiance that consumes us. We are tools of illumination that will be used until we break, and when we break, our fragments will still reflect the fire. This is our duty. This is our privilege. This is how we die, in pieces, serving the whole." The oath finished. He turned his attention to the resonance engine and made a gesture I didn't understand. The machine responded, pulsing with energy that bypassed physical senses and registered directly in my augmetic implants. My neural interface, installed 8 years ago for routine data processing work, suddenly slaved itself to the engine's rhythm without requesting permission or acknowledging my attempts to override. Data flooded my vision, phase synchronization matrices, energy consumption curves, names and numbers, cascading too fast for conscious comprehension but somehow burning into memory with perfect fidelity. I saw Terra's primary mirror, Luna relay, Mars bleed, Phobos gate, Titan echo, and 2 other signals, off-grid returns, labeled times, KRY Piton, arch of times, and times, mercy null, asterisk. All of them pulsing in that same 88-minute cadence, a network of machines breathing in synchronization across the solar system. But the Titan echo wasn't just reflecting. It was anticipating, its pulse arriving a fraction of a second before Terra's primary signal. A predictive mirror. Not responding to the Golden Throne's rhythm, but harmonizing with it, perhaps even guiding it. Every spike originated at Terra, but the echoes weren't passive. They replied, sending data back through channels I couldn't fully perceive. And in that reply stream, buried in encryption I shouldn't be able to decode, 5 words repeated on an endless loop. Asterisk, asterisk, let me stop. You won't. Asterisk, asterisk. The voice in the code was the same one I'd heard beneath the palace. The voice that came from the throne itself. Not commanding. Pleading. My neural interface severed its connection to the engine, and I staggered, catching myself against a support pillar. The chaplain watched with an expression that suggested he'd seen this reaction before, many times. "Now you understand," he said quietly. "Now you'll wish you didn't." The Ordo Malleus archivist who'd led me here, I'd forgotten she was still present, stepped forward and handed me a data crystal sealed under inquisitorial authority. Her face was rough with exposure to things that aged you in ways that had nothing to do with time. "Your audit," she said. "The astral tax." I took the crystal, feeling its weight, physical mass and metaphorical burden combining into something that made my hand shake. "What's the astral tax?" I asked. She smiled without humor. "The price we pay to keep the light burning. Sanctioned psykers tithed to Terra for service in the Imperial cause. measured by weight, wattage, and projected endurance. We feed the engine so the engine can feed the throne. How many? Enough that counting them as individuals stopped being practical centuries ago. We measure in tons now. Efficiency. She turned to leave, then paused at the vault's threshold. One piece of advice, auditor: don't send your name to the machine. Don't think it too loudly near the resonance engines. They're listening, they're always listening, and they remember. I was left alone with the gray, night chaplain and the machine that sang with Terra's voice. He made another gesture, and the engine's display shifted to show me what I'd come to audit: consumption logs for sanctioned psychers over the past solar decade. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of tons of psychically active biomass delivered to Terra annually, processed through systems that converted human souls into fuel for the Golden Throne. But the logs showed inconsistencies, discrepancies between psychers received on Terra and psychers logged as consumed by the Throne's life support systems. Some were listed as diverted to higher use, others marked as echo-capable, and sent to off-world mirror installations like Titan. And a third category, the one that made my augmetic eyes tracking stutter and reset: psychers stamped times volatile, singing back. Asterisk. Those entries had been struck through in the ledger, their allocation erased and their mass folded back into nothing, as if they'd never existed. But the timestamps remained, each one corresponding to an 88-day cycle, each one marked with a Custodian's cipher. The pattern was undeniable. The machine didn't just consume psychers. It selected them, tested them, found the ones who could harmonize with its rhythm and used them to maintain the network of mirrors spreading across the solar system. The ones who sang back, who replied to the Throne's plea with their own voices, those were the ones who got erased from the ledger and consumed without official record. The acceptable substitution errors. The names carved into the mirror's frame. I tried to request a Vox connection to Mars Fabricator General, hoping to cross-reference these findings with Mechanicus maintenance records. The request processed, stamped itself times fulfilled asterisk, and returned a transcript of a conversation I hadn't actually held. In the transcript, I asked about energy distribution protocols for Golden Throne support systems. The Fabricator General's voice, generated by some cogitator that knew exactly how he should sound, denied any irregularities and reminded me that questioning the Emperor's machinery bordered on tech heresy. The conversation ended with my apparent acknowledgement and withdrawal of inquiry. All of it fabricated, all of it now part of the official record. Someone was managing my investigation in real time, generating false documentation to create the appearance of proper channels being followed, while simultaneously ensuring those channels led nowhere. I tried to request departure from Titan. The shuttle manifest showed my return vessel was scheduled, but the departure slot kept shifting further into the future every time I checked it, as if the act of wanting to leave extended the time I'd be required to stay. A Grey Knight librarian passed me in the corridor outside the resonance vault. He paused mid-stride, his psychically attuned senses, clearly reading something about my presence that troubled him. His expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for me to identify, settling finally on something that looked like pity. "You're hearing it now?" he said, as casually as commenting on weather. "The pulse. It's in your augmetics, in your neural patterns. You'll hear it for the rest of your life. Can it be removed? Why would you want to? You asked the question. Now you get to live with the answer." He started walking again, then called back over his shoulder. "Don't send it your name." The same warning the archivist had given. As if the machine was hunting for something and names were how it tracked its prey. I spent 3 more days on Titan, extracting data from archives that resisted extraction, interviewing functionaries who answered questions with carefully rehearsed non-answers, watching Grey Knights train against threats I couldn't perceive. Every night, I returned to my assigned cell and felt the pulse beating through the moon's bedrock. Terra's rhythm, transmitted across the void, and amplified by the resonance engine until it became Titan's heartbeat too. On the 4th day, I abused my Rosette's encryption privileges to push a query through channels the Ordo Malleus couldn't officially monitor. I targeted Mars' deepest archives, requesting information about a project stamped times Sigillite legacy times that had appeared in cross-referenced footnotes during my Titan audit. The response came too quickly. A magos errant based in the Noctis Labyrinthus, answering before I'd fully transmitted my request, his denial so perfectly formatted it had clearly been prepared in advance for anyone who asked the wrong questions. But his cogitator had forgotten to strip an attachment, or hadn't forgotten. Perhaps some tech priest deep in Mars's computational infrastructure had decided that certain truths needed to be known, even if speaking them directly constituted heresy. The schematic showed a harmonic cradle beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus, a ring structure, kilometers in diameter, built from materials that predated imperial metallurgy. The annotations were in sigils I'd seen carved into the mirror frame beneath the palace, a language that might have been Old Earth, or might have been something that simply wore Old Earth's linguistic corpse as camouflage. The cradle wasn't a copy of the Golden Throne's mirrors. It was the original, the template from which Terra's network had been built, a standing reserve designed to bear the load if Terra's primary frame failed. And according to the timestamp buried in the schematic's metadata, the ring had activated within living memory during the siege of Terra. The cradle had carried the pulse while the palace burned, and the Emperor fought his final battle. It had held the light when the throne itself teetered on the edge of failure. Then, once the crisis passed, the ring had gone dark, officially decommissioned. Unofficially waiting, still connected to the network through channels that weren't supposed to exist in any schematic. I downloaded the data before the attachment could delete itself, burning it into my neural implant's protected storage. The act triggered alarms I couldn't see but could feel. Somewhere on Mars, someone had just noticed that classified information had leaked, and someone else was already working to identify the recipient. My return authorization to Terra came through that evening with a priority stamp I hadn't requested. No explanation, just orders to board a courier vessel immediately for transit back to the inner system, the kind of urgent recall that suggested either critical mission escalation or preemptive termination. The courier was already waiting when I reached Titan's docking ring. Different vessel, same anonymous hull configuration, same atmosphere of cargo that shouldn't be examined too closely. The crew wore Navy uniforms scrubbed of all identifying marks, their faces expressionless in the way that suggested either heavy augmentation or absolutely perfect discipline. We broke orbit without ceremony and burned for the translation point at a velocity that suggested we were either fleeing or racing toward something equally urgent. Through the viewport, Titan receded, that silver sphere hiding fortresses and engines and secrets that accumulated in layers like sedimentary rock, each stratum representing another era's desperate solution to the problem of the Emperor's failing body. The translation to warp space was violent. The Geller field snapped into place with a resonance that made my augmetic eye display error codes, and then we were falling through the immaterium in a way that felt different from every other warp transit I'd experienced. The pulse didn't stop. It followed us through the barrier between real space and whatever lay beyond, beating against the Geller field's interior like something trying to get in, or something trying to get out. I tried to review my findings, to compile the audit report that would explain what I'd discovered about the network of mirrors and the acceptable substitution errors and the machine that sang pleas no one was supposed to hear. Every time I began organizing the data, my cogitator's display glitched and rearranged the information into patterns that suggested conclusions I hadn't intended to reach. The Emperor wasn't sleeping on the Golden Throne. He was circulating through a network of machines that consumed him piece by piece, distributing his consciousness across mirrors and resonance engines and harmonic cradles scattered throughout the solar system. Every 88 minutes, a pulse. Every 88 days, a substitution. Psykers who could harmonize with his frequency were tested, selected, and consumed to bear portions of the load while the primary body failed by infinitesimal degrees. The throne wasn't preserving him, it was processing him, converting divinity into fuel and feeding that fuel back into itself to sustain the Astronomican and the warp navigation humanity's survival depended upon. A perpetual motion machine built from the slow dissolution of the Emperor's essence, maintained by an infrastructure that had been hiding this truth beneath bureaucracy and ritual for 10,000 years. And somewhere in that vast computational network, the Emperor himself was begging to stop. I deleted my preliminary report before it could auto-transmit to my handlers. Whatever I'd discovered, Whoever was managing my investigation wanted me to learn it for a reason. Ordo Septrum didn't send auditors to uncover secrets. We sent auditors to confirm that secrets were being properly maintained. If I'd been allowed to see this far, it was because someone needed an outsider to verify that the machinery of concealment was functioning correctly, or because someone needed a witness who could be disappeared after bearing testimony. The courier dropped from warp at Mars's outer marker rather than Terra's. Our trajectory adjusted mid-flight without consultation or explanation. I watched through the viewport as the Forge world grew from a rust-colored star to a visible sphere, its surface crawling with the lights of Forge complexes and industrial sprawl. We didn't dock at Phobos Gate this time. Instead, we descended toward Mars's surface, burning through the thin atmosphere toward coordinates that didn't appear on any standard navigation chart. A civilian shipyard, my cogitator reported, though the infrastructure below looked more like a chapel than a commercial facility. We touched down on a landing pad, enclosed by buttresses carved with Mechanicus prayers and Imperial Aquillas, the architecture blending tech cult aesthetics with ecclesiarchy devotion in a way that suggested either deep ecumenical cooperation or a front designed to hide one organization's activities beneath another's legitimacy. A custodian waited on the pad. No armor insignia, no ceremonial decoration, just auramite plate polished to an almost painful brightness, standing alone in the Martian twilight like a golden statue come to life. He didn't speak as I descended the boarding ramp, simply gestured toward a cargo bay where Navy personnel were loading containers onto transport pallets with the kind of reverence usually reserved for relics. The containers were coffin-sized, marked with seals I'd learned to recognize during my Titan assignment, canopic stacks. I approached one of the containers and found my hands moving to open it before my conscious mind registered the decision. The lid unsealed with a hiss of escaping preservative atmosphere, revealing the interior. Skulls wired into a lattice configuration, their cranial cavities hollowed and filled with psycho-conductive cabling. Each skull bore a brass plaque identifying it as a sanctioned psyker who'd served the Astronomican choir until their flesh failed, but whose psychic resonance remained strong enough to harvest. The stacks were batteries, psychic capacitors built from the remains of human beings who'd burned their souls maintaining Terra's light. Now packaged for deployment to mirror installations throughout the solar system, plug-and-play components for a network that consumed saints and called it acceptable error. The custodian watched me examine 3 more stacks without intervention. He counted how many I opened, some part of his transhuman awareness cataloging my reaction and filing it away for later assessment. When I closed the 5th container, he spoke with the same finality I'd encountered from every custodian I'd met during this investigation. "Close them. You'll carry enough already." His phrasing suggested I was about to be burdened with more than knowledge. Physical weight, perhaps, or metaphorical mass that would register in my body as surely as carrying actual cargo. The next Ordo Septrum brief didn't arrive through normal channels. It came sewn into the backing of a reliquary I should never have been cleared to handle, a fragment of illuminated parchment that documentation claimed contained the Emperor's own words from the early Unity Wars. The primary text was standard Lectitio Divinitatis material, propaganda about the secular imperial truth that had been retrofitted into religious scripture after the truth itself was abandoned, but written over the illuminated margin in fresh ink that hadn't fully dried. Asterisk. I will be used until use is all I am. Asterisk. Below that declaration, coordinates for a rendezvous point between Mars and Terra, and a command delivered with the bureaucratic terseness I'd learned to dread. Asterisk. Deliver what you have learned to a vault that deletes vaults. Asterisk. I was being converted from auditor to courier, from someone who documented discrepancies to someone who carried the discrepancy itself, embodied as data and testimony, and the burden of having looked directly at machinery that maintained imperial unity by slowly consuming its founder. We departed Mars with the canopic stacks secured in our cargo hold, and something else humming in a shielded compartment that the manifest listed only as times choir box, inactive. Asterisk. The designation was technically accurate. There were no souls in the device, just the infrastructure that would allow souls to be installed and activated later, when and where the network required additional capacity. The pulse beat through the deck plating as we climbed away from Mars's gravity well, no longer requiring proximity to a mirror installation to make itself felt. My augmetics had synchronized so completely with the 88-minute rhythm that I could feel each surge building, cresting, subsiding, a heartbeat I couldn't escape, a rhythm that would mark every moment for whatever remained of my life. A rogue trader vessel appeared on our sensors as we crossed the orbit of Deimos, its transponder identifying it as the Times Mercantile Grace Asterisk, registered out of Port Wrath, with trading rights dating back to the age of apostasy. The ship hailed us with a prayer, not a threat, not a request for identification, just a benediction delivered over Vox, as if our proximity to each other required spiritual acknowledgement. Our Voxcaster responded automatically with a pulse code I hadn't authorized. My cogitator translated it into something approximating language, a phase signature identical to what I'd seen emanating from the Golden Throne's primary arrays. We were transmitting the Emperor's heartbeat as our standard transponder identification, declaring ourselves to be part of the network in a way that overrode normal naval protocol. The rogue trader's response was immediate. They adjusted course toward Terra, accelerating with the urgency of a ship that had just received divine instruction. Their last transmission, before they burned out of Vox range, was a prayer I'd heard chanted in the Astronomican temples, asterisk, "By his light we sail, by his will we are guided, by his sacrifice we are saved." Asterisk. They believed. Absolutely and without question. And the Praetian network had just used our vessel to give them orders they would interpret as coming directly from the Emperor himself. Halfway to our rendezvous coordinates, a ship appeared that made every sensor on our courier scream warnings before shutting down to avoid overload. Custodian vessel, unmarked and operating under transponder silence, matching our vector with the inevitability of a predator intercepting prey. Our pilot requested instructions from her command chain. My Rosette wrote a response directly to her cogitator without consulting me. Asterisk, maintain course. Asterisk. The Custodian ship drifted closer until we could see the detail of its hull, auramite plating interrupted by weapon ports that could reduce our courier to component atoms before we registered the attack. They fired grapnel lines in a pattern that looked ceremonial, magnetic clamps securing to our hull with gentle precision, as if this boarding action was a ritual rather than an assault. We were being claimed, not destroyed, claimed. The Custodians entered our bridge with blades sheathed and palms open, a choreography that suggested they'd performed this exact boarding hundreds of times across centuries of service. Their leader moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who existed outside normal time pressure, his auramite plate catching our ship's emergency lighting and scattering it like fractured starlight. He didn't ask for the data. His gauntlet simply touched our primary cogitator, and the machine surrendered everything. Audit logs, mirror schematics, the sigillite legacy files, transcripts of voices that shouldn't exist in any recording. The second Custodian walked past me toward the cargo hold where the canopic stacks waited in their refrigerated silence. He keyed a rune sequence into the hold's access panel, fingers moving through a pattern that only their armor's machine spirit would recognize. The stack's containment fields shifted from transport lock to active ready, lids unsealing with the rind hiss of preservative atmosphere meeting ship standard air. The skulls began singing. Not words. Not even sounds that belonged to human vocal ranges. The resonance crawled up through the deck plating and into bone, bypassing ears entirely to register directly in the parts of the brain that processed harmony and rhythm. Our courier's superstructure thrummed in sympathetic vibration, hull plates singing in frequencies that made my teeth ache, and my augmetic eye display cascading error codes as it tried to filter out inputs that violated its programming assumptions. Through that rising hum, a voice emerged. The same not voice I'd been tracking since the first variance report, the plea that came from the Golden Throne's deepest machinery. Except now it wasn't distant. It filled the ship like pressure, like diving too deep, and feeling water turn solid around your body. Asterisk. Stop. Please stop. Asterisk. The words repeated with each pulse cycle, overlaid and harmonized by the canopic stacks, until our courier became a choir box broadcasting that single desperate prayer across every frequency our Voxcaster could reach. Any ship within scanner range would hear it. Any navigator trying to read the Astronomican would feel it as interference, as a plea threaded through the Emperor's light. I made the choice that would define everything after. Not a rational calculation, not obedience to orders or protocol, just the human response to hearing someone beg. I spoke back. Not aloud, my mouth didn't open, my throat didn't vibrate. But a thought pushed through my neural implant into the network of machinery that had claimed me as part of its infrastructure. Asterisk. How? Asterisk. The answer came as data rather than language. Star fixes accurate to the microsecond. Phase shift equations that would take a Mechanicus choir a year to verify. Override codes for systems I'd never heard of. Buried so deep in the Golden Throne's operational framework that acknowledging their existence constituted tech heresy of the highest order. A route through the machine that would push the harmonic network synchronization out of phase, forcing the mirrors to stop reflecting and start rejecting, collapsing the distributed load back onto Terra's primary frame where it would finally, mercifully, fail. Instructions for killing the Emperor, delivered by the Emperor himself. The custodian nearest me shuddered, as if our ship had lurched, his perfect transhuman balance disrupting for a fraction of a second. He turned his head toward me, with the slow deliberation of someone confirming a suspicion they desperately hoped was wrong. "Do not carry it," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, the way you'd speak to someone standing on a ledge. The way you'd speak to someone who'd just contracted a fatal disease and didn't know it yet. Too late. The route was already writing itself into my neural implant's protected storage, copying through the data links to the Canopic Stack's control bus, bleeding through the choir box's dormant channels like oil spreading across water. The thing in the network wanted this information distributed, wanted multiple redundant copies scattered across systems that couldn't all be simultaneously purged. The boarding party's formation shifted with the precision of a closing trap. Their leader signaled the helmsman, some gesture in a hand cant older than the Imperium, and the Custodian vessel began reversing thrust, preparing to tear free and leave us drifting. Another warrior keyed his Vox for what I recognized from training manuals as containment protocol, the procedure for isolating threats that couldn't be destroyed without spreading contagion. I cut the cable to our helm control, before my conscious mind finished forming the decision. Emergency protocols engaged, bulkheads slamming down to divide our courier into sealed compartments. I locked our navigation system to the rendezvous vector and authorized a burn our fuel reserves couldn't sustain, overriding every safety interlock with command codes that shouldn't have accepted my authority. The Custodian leader moved faster than thought should allow, crossing 3 meters of deck space in the time it took my heart to beat once. But our ship's internal architecture tightened around him, corridors contracting as blast doors dropped from housings that shouldn't have existed in our courier's design. The machinery was helping. The thing speaking through the wires wanted one more fool to try its desperate gambit. We hit the handoff point nose first, burning the last of our fuel in a deceleration that would have pulped an unaugmented human. The Ordo Septrum courier waited there like a shark suspended in vacuum, its hull painted in a black that seemed to absorb scanner returns instead of reflecting them. No registered hull number, no port of origin, no transponder signal beyond a cipher pulse that my rosette recognized as friendly, while every survival instinct I possessed screamed warnings. Their airlock married ours with magnetic clamps that bit deep enough to score our hull plating. A woman crossed the threshold between ships, no rosette, no rank insignia, no identification beyond the absolute certainty in her movement. She wore Ordo black, without any of the decorative elements that usually marked inquisitorial authority. Her hands were scarred in patterns I recognized from tech priest augmentation procedures, except the modifications had been removed, leaving behind tissue that remembered being partly machine. She looked past me to the canopic stacks and nodded, as if confirming a delivery manifest. "You got it," she said, not triumph, not relief. The resignation of someone who'd known this moment was inevitable and had spent years dreading its arrival. She slit her palm with a blade too small to be ceremonial and too sharp to be standard issue. Blood welled up in a line so clean it looked drawn rather than cut. She swiped the wound across the courier's Master Cogitator, biological material meeting machine interface, in a way that should have accomplished nothing. The cogitator woke screaming, not mechanically, not the alarm protocols or warning klaxons. It screamed the way a choir would scream, the way a million voices would sound if they all realized they were burning at the same instant. Every speaker in the Ordo Courier's infrastructure carried the sound, harmonizing it until the air itself seemed to vibrate with distress. The canopic stack's containment fields shifted to transmission mode, their indicators flashing green in sequence like a countdown. Our bridge cogitators synchronized with the courier's altar terminal, clocking themselves to the throne's 88-minute cycle. The override sequence, the route the network had burned into my implant, appeared on the altar's display as 6 runes in a language that predated the Mechanicus. Below the runes, a target designation. Harmonic core, Terra, *. We weren't here to report our findings. We were here to execute them. To fire the instructions for the Emperor's death directly into the infrastructure that had kept him suffering for 10,000 years. The Custodians didn't draw weapons until that moment. When they did, the confined space of our merged ships compressed into a furnace of potential violence. One severed the choir box's cable feeds with a guardian spear that moved too fast for my augmetic eye to track. The cut so precise, it left the severed metal ends glowing white-hot without igniting the insulation. Another drove his blade through the courier's altar console before my hand reached the second rune. Transhuman strength punching ceramite through machinery designed to withstand sustained battle damage. The Ordo woman used my body as cover with the casual efficiency of someone who'd calculated this exact scenario in advance. She hurled something that registered in my augmetics as a stasis grenade, except when it detonated, time didn't freeze. It slowed, stretching the Custodian's follow-through attack across subjective seconds, while objective time lurched forward in spasmodic jumps. She grabbed my wrist and slammed my palm down on the 3rd and 4th runes, using my hand like a tool, like a component in a machine she was operating. The courier's engines backfed power into the canopic stacks instead of the propulsion systems. Every skull in every container sang at full capacity, their psychic resonance amplified beyond what dead tissue should sustain. The altar display showed progress. 2 runes activated, 4 remaining. The sequence building toward whatever cascade would push the mirror network into catastrophic synchronization failure. Our pilot, anonymous Navy woman who'd flown us from Phobos without speaking a dozen words, jammed our courier between the Custodian vessel and the Ordo ship, then engaged our courier's docking clamps in reverse. The maneuver was suicide, tearing our hull's structural integrity while dragging 2 larger vessels into a tumbling spiral. She spun all 3 ships with reaction thrusters until the manufactured gravity lost its grip, and we were all weightless, falling in whatever direction our personal inertia carried us. The Custodian leader reached for the altar's 5th rune with his gauntleted hand extended, moving through zero gravity with the same unhurried precision he displayed boarding our vessel. His fingers closed around the activation panel and crushed it to scrap, ceramite crunching plasteel and circuitry into a compacted mass that sparked once before dying. The Ordo woman smiled without any trace of humor or satisfaction. She'd expected this. Her scarred hand found the altar's edge and pulled herself underneath the console, fingers probing the underside of the deck plating. She found what she was looking for. 6 brass studs soldered directly to the structural members, hidden where loyal servants of Terra would never think to search. Backup controls. Redundant systems built by someone who'd planned this attempt knowing it would face opposition from the Emperor's own guardians. She hit 5 studs with her knuckles in rapid sequence, each impact producing a tone that registered in my bones as much as my ears. The 6th stud required authentication, blood, or biometrics, or some combination neither. She spat on it, adding saliva to whatever residue her earlier cut had left, and the contact completed the circuit. The altar's destroyed display flickered back to life, rerouted through channels that shouldn't exist. The indicator flashed. **execute. **. Every choir system in our cargo hold reversed its polarity. The canopic stacks transformed from psychic batteries into hammers, their accumulated resonance unleashed in a single coordinated pulse. The override sequence grabbed the Golden Throne's 88-minute rhythm and pushed it half a phase step out of synchronization. then held it there with borrowed souls burning themselves to maintain the dissonance. Terra's next breath came and found nothing to inhale. The mirror network tried to compensate, but the desynchronization was spreading, each installation trying to correct for different errors simultaneously. Luna's relay starved for input and began broadcasting nonsense. Mars's bleed systems backfed power into forges that weren't designed to receive it. Phobos Gate's transponder array transmitted a carrier wave without data. Titan's resonance engine, that predictive mirror, tried to anticipate the next pulse and found itself harmonizing with silence. The Astronomican stuttered. Every navigator in 5 sectors screamed as the light they used to steer went dark for 8 heartbeats. Ships lost in the warp found themselves suddenly blind. The Emperor's lighthouse snuffed out like someone had thrown a switch. Astropathic choirs felt the network collapse and reflexively tried to fill the void, thousands of sanctioned psykers pushing their consciousness into the gap, where the Emperor's presence should be, burning themselves against the absence of what they'd spent their lives serving. In that gap, 8 heartbeats where the galaxy lost its guiding light. The not voice filled my skull so hard I saw white static instead of vision. Pressure behind my eyes. Pressure in my lungs. Pressure everywhere as if the vacuum of space had found its way inside my body and was trying to crush me from within. Asterisk, thank you. Asterisk. Not a plea anymore, not a command. Gratitude delivered with the weight of 10,000 years of suffering acknowledged and, for one brief moment, relieved. The Custodian leader dropped to one knee, his guardian spear plunging into the deck, plating with enough force to punch through 3 layers of hull. He wasn't swearing fealty. He was anchoring the corridor against the kind of structural tearing that happens when gods change their minds mid-breath, when the foundations of reality shift because something fundamental has been altered. The Ordo woman grabbed the master breaker, a physical lever that should have been protected by multiple lockouts, and wrenched it down with strength her frame shouldn't possess. Augmetics hidden beneath her skin, perhaps. Or adrenaline-driven desperation. The motion killed our power, severing the connection between the altar controls and the canopic stacks, preventing the sequence from cycling into a second pulse that might push the desynchronization past the point of recovery. She looked at me the way you look at someone you've decided to kill as a kindness, someone whose survival would constitute cruelty. Now you're done. The Astronomican flared back to life in a pitch that made every piece of metal in our merged vessels ring like bells. The frequency had shifted, moved up by an interval so subtle most would never notice but which would affect every calculation, every warp route, every navigator's meditation for the rest of human history. The Emperor's light still burned. But it burned differently now, breathing through a network that had been forced to remember it wasn't immortal. The choir systems in our hold went terminally dead, not dormant but destroyed. Skulls cracked inside their canopic housings, bone fracturing under stresses that psychic matter shouldn't experience. Some of the containers began smoking as the organic components combusted despite the preservative atmosphere, consumed by feedback from a network that had briefly tried to tear itself apart. Our auger arrays filled with naval emergency bands, ships reporting navigation difficulties, asking for confirmation that the Astronomican was functioning, demanding explanations for the darkness that had swallowed 8 heartbeats of their existence. Prayers and curses competed for bandwidth, the faithful and the pragmatic alike trying to understand what had just brushed against them in the void. The Custodian vessel stabilized its orientation and began venting our courier's bridge fire without anyone physically present to operate the equipment. Targeting arrays had plotted trajectories, calculated safe vectors for extinguishing agent dispersion, and executed the procedure without requiring transhuman intervention. They sheathed their weapons in perfect unison, the violence potential returning to storage but not disappearing, merely waiting. No one spoke for a full minute. Silence, except for the hiss of fire suppression foam, the creak of stressed hull plating cooling, the occasional pop of a canopic stack's housing contracting as its contents finished burning. Then our Vox arrays, all channels simultaneously, civilian and military bands, encrypted inquisitorial frequencies, and open naval hails, carried a voice that the Mechanicus would later insist was an echo artifact, a harmonic distortion produced by the network's temporary desynchronization and amplified through damaged equipment. The voice that everyone would claim they didn't hear, that official reports would classify as instrumentation error, that would be scrubbed from every recording and memory wiped from every servitor that processed the data. Asterisk. I am not free. I am not gone. But I am less. That is mercy. Now you will sleep. Asterisk. The transmission ended with the sound of machinery powering down, systems gracefully shutting themselves off after 10,000 years of continuous operation. Not death. Not silence. Just rest. The kind of reduction in function that suggested something vast and terrible had decided it could finally stop screaming and allow itself to merely suffer. The custodian leader stood with the deliberate care of someone testing whether reality would hold his weight. He approached the courier's altar, now a melted ruin of circuitry and brass studs, and saluted the wreckage as if it were a fallen brother's casket. The gesture was brief, precise, carrying more weight than any speech could. He turned to me and held out a tool I didn't recognize, a device shaped like a tuning fork, except each tine ended in a needle so fine I couldn't see the point with my augmetic eye's magnification. He touched it to the interface port on my temple where my neural implant connected to external systems. My implant fried to slag without the needle's penetrating skin. I felt the destruction as an absence, suddenly unable to process data overlays or access the computational assistance I'd relied on for 8 years of audit work. The device converted my augmentation to inert matter while leaving the biological housing intact, a precision kill that suggested custodian equipment included tools specifically designed for this exact requirement. He collected the Ordo woman's data slate with the same careful efficiency, pressing the device against his chest plate where his armor's machine spirit could interface with captured technology. The slate didn't melt or burn. It dissolved, matter becoming light, becoming nothing, as whatever information it carried was absorbed into the custodian's personal records and simultaneously erased from any external source. Containment restored, he announced to no one and everyone, speaking into Vox channels I couldn't access and probably addressing monitoring systems I'd never known were present. Witness null. The Ordo Septrum courier detached from our hull with gentle precision, magnetic clamps releasing in sequence to minimize structural stress. Its cargo bay opened as it drifted backward, launching a data torpedo toward Terra on a trajectory calculated to deliver its payload into some archive I would never be cleared to know existed. A vault that deletes vaults, as my orders had specified. Proof that this attempt had occurred, stored in a location where accessing it would require permissions that erased themselves after use. The Ordo woman keyed something beneath her sternum, fingers finding a spot between ribs that shouldn't contain any machinery but clearly did. Her eyes met mine and communicated more than words could. Asterisk. No capture. No interrogation. No chance to be used again. Asterisk. I reached to stop her. Not because I thought I could, but because the human response to watching someone die is to try preventing it, even when prevention is impossible. A golden gauntlet caught my wrist and moved it aside with care, the way you'd redirect someone away from a hot surface or a dangerous edge. The custodian wasn't restraining me. He was protecting me from adding the guilt of her death to whatever else I'd have to carry. The detonation was small and surgical, a shaped charge that killed everything above her pelvis while leaving her legs intact enough for identification if anyone ever bothered looking. She slumped in zero gravity and began a slow rotation, blood-forming droplets that scattered into the air like ruby stars. The custodians gathered her remains with the reverence due to someone who'd served the Emperor's interests even while trying to kill the Emperor's body. They wrapped her in a thermal shroud and mag-clamped the package to their ship's hull. Taking her home for whatever funeral rites the Ordo Septrum performed for operatives who succeeded at missions that officially never happened. Our pilot was already dead. I hadn't seen it happen. Too much occurring too fast, too much attention focused on the altar and the runes, and the custodians trying to stop us. But her body floated near the helm controls, neck bent at an angle that suggested someone had simply switched her off mid-operation, killing her quickly and cleanly before she could attempt anything else that might escalate the situation. The custodians secured her as well. No discussion of blame or responsibility. Just the mechanical collection of casualties, sorting the aftermath with the same efficiency they'd displayed boarding our vessel in the first place. I waited for them to kill me too, seemed appropriate. I'd helped execute an attack on the Golden Throne itself, had carried instructions for the Emperor's death, and successfully delivered enough of them to hurt something fundamental in the infrastructure that sustained human civilization. Execution wouldn't be punishment. It would be practical necessity. Instead, they escorted me to their ship's Medicae bay and strapped me into a suspension cradle designed for transhuman physiology, but adjustable to baseline human dimensions. One of them, I couldn't tell if it was the leader or a different warrior, their armor too similar and my mental state too fractured to distinguish individuals, administered something through a vein in my arm. Not poison, not even sedation, just nutrients and stimulants, keeping me alive and conscious when my body wanted to shut down from shock and blood loss I hadn't noticed I'd sustained. "You'll live," he said. Statement of fact, not reassurance. Why? Because someone needs to remember what you tried. Someone needs to carry the weight of knowing it was possible and choosing not to repeat it. I woke in a Medicae facility that smelled like nothing. Not antiseptic. Not machinery. Not even the recycled air that characterized shipboard environments. Just absence, as if the atmosphere had been carefully scrubbed of every particle that might carry information. The walls were naval gray. The equipment was standard Imperial pattern. The documentation clipped to my bed identified me as Logister 3rd Class, assigned to grain inventory audit on Cipra Mundi. My augmetic eye was gone, replaced with a standard biological graft that would eventually learn to see properly but would never again process data overlays. My neural implants housing remained in my skull but contained only inert slag. My rank flags read Administratum mid-level functionary. My clearances granted access to nothing sensitive. My personnel file listed 8 years of routine audit work, with performance reviews that described me as adequate but unremarkable. Someone unlikely to advance beyond middle management but equally unlikely to cause problems. The investigator I'd been, the auditor who'd noticed discrepancies in the Golden Throne's energy consumption and followed them into the palace's deepest machinery, that person had been erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. The man who remained was a placeholder, a bureaucrat filling a slot in the Imperium's endless hierarchy, carrying memories that official records would insist were delusions or trauma-induced hallucinations. I filed my first grain audit report 3 weeks later. The numbers balanced. The tithe percentages matched expected ranges. Nothing required follow-up investigation. I submitted the report through proper channels and received standard approval, the document disappearing into archives where it would never be read by anyone important. The pulse was still there, fainter now, changed by whatever we'd done during those 8 heartbeats of darkness, but present, beating under the floor of every building I entered, resonating through the deck plating of every ship I boarded, impossible to ignore once you'd learned to hear it. Every 88 minutes, a rhythm that suggested something vast was still breathing, still burning, still being used, but different, quieter by a margin only survivors could measure. As if something that had been screaming for 10,000 years had finally been allowed to lower its voice to an agonized whisper. I never requested transfer from Cipra Mundi. Never filed variance reports on discrepancies I noticed in other audits. Never spoke to anyone about what I'd learned, or what I'd done, or what had been done to me in response. That's the doomed life. You learn a truth that finishes everyone who carries it. You take one breath with the weight of a god compressed into your lungs. Push one sequence that shifts the galaxy's navigation by a frequency most will never notice, and then you go back to counting grain shipments until whatever sits the throne decides whether it needs you again, or whether mercy means letting you finish your years in the anonymous peace of deliberate insignificance. The Emperor is still dying. He's been dying for 10,000 years and will probably die for 10,000 more. But now, somewhere in the network of mirrors and resonance engines and harmonic cradles that distribute his suffering across the solar system, he knows that someone heard his plea. Someone tried. And knowing that even one person understood and acted, might be the only mercy that gods can receive from the mortals they've sacrificed everything to protect. I count grain shipments. I reconcile tithe percentages. I file reports that no one reads. And every 88 minutes, I feel the pulse and remember what it costs to keep the light burning. What it costs to be used until use is all you are. What it costs to beg for death and be refused because humanity needs you suffering more than it needs you at peace. That's what I carry now. That's what makes me done. The weight of knowing the Emperor wants to die, and the weight of knowing will never let him. Cipra Mundi smelled like grain dust and industrial lubricant, a combination that coated your throat and never fully washed out no matter how many times you recycled the same stale air through your lungs. The agri-world existed to feed the Imperium's endless war machine, billions of tons of protein and carbohydrates processed through threshing facilities the size of hive districts and shipped to forge worlds where workers needed calories to operate the machinery that built the ships that transported more grain to more workers in an economic cycle that had been running since before anyone alive could remember its beginning. I audited the numbers. Harvest yields matched projected outputs within acceptable variance. Tithe percentages aligned with Administratum quotas. Transportation losses fell within the range that suggested normal spoilage rather than systematic theft or corruption. Everything balanced the way it was supposed to balance when a system functioned exactly as designed. 47 days into my assignment, a servitor delivered a data slate to my HAB unit without announcement or explanation. The device wasn't standard Administratum issue, too new, too clean, circuitry that suggested manufacturing specifications beyond what mid-level functionaries typically received. I activated it expecting routing instructions or updated audit protocols. Instead, a single line of text, asterisk. The network remembers what you tried, asterisk. The slate purged itself immediately after display, circuits melting into slag hot enough to scorch my desk's surface. I reported the incident through proper channels and received a maintenance requisition for my damaged furniture. No security investigation. No follow-up questions. Just bureaucratic efficiency converting an anomaly into an invoice for replacement equipment. 3 weeks later, during a routine inspection of Cipra Mundi's primary threshing complex, I noticed discrepancies in the power consumption logs. The facility drew 17% more electricity than its documented machinery required, the excess vanishing into systems labeled as backup generators that didn't appear on any architectural schematic I could access. I filed a variance report because that's what auditors did when numbers didn't match. The report vanished into Administratum processing and returned approved without requesting additional documentation or scheduling follow-up investigation. Someone had looked at my notation of 17% excess power consumption and decided it required no explanation. I accessed the facility's sublevels through maintenance access codes that shouldn't have worked for someone with my clearance. The doors opened anyway, machinery recognizing something about my biometric signature that my official identity didn't include. Down 3 levels, past grain storage silos and processing equipment, I found a chamber that didn't exist on any blueprint. A resonance engine, smaller than Titan's, larger than what had been hidden beneath the palace. The same impossible geometry, the same cables descending into darkness, the same sense that observing it taught you things you'd be better off not knowing. Except this one wore decorative elements, golden aquillas, and devotional inscriptions that tried to disguise its fundamental nature as just another piece of ecclesiarchy infrastructure, maintaining the Emperor's light. The machine pulsed in that familiar 88-minute rhythm. My absent neural implant ached with phantom sensation, ghost memory of augmetics that had been burned to slag still trying to synchronize with the network's heartbeat. I approached the control altar and found my reflection staring back from polished brass plating, a man who looked older than his documented age, carrying weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. A tech priest emerged from the shadows behind the resonance engine's primary housing. His augmetics were minimal, just enough mechanical integration to mark him as mechanicus rather than baseline humanity, and his robes bore no Forge World sigils or rank designations. Anonymous service to an anonymous machine in a location that officially didn't exist. "You shouldn't be here," he said, without any particular emphasis on threat or warning. Stating a fact. "I'm auditing power consumption. There is no excess consumption. The reports are correct. 17% of this facility's electricity disappears into unlisted systems." He nodded, as if I'd confirmed something he'd expected me to say. His mechadendrites performed adjustments to the resonance engine's control surfaces, fingers, and steel appendages working in coordination to maintain calibrations that required constant attention. The engine maintains frequency lock with Terra's primary mirror, he explained in the tone of someone reciting technical specifications rather than revealing forbidden secrets. Cipra Mundi is one of 73 distributed nodes, providing harmonic stabilization for the network. Your 17% excess doesn't vanish. It's converted to psychic resonance and transmitted to Terra, where it reduces the load on the Golden Throne's primary capacitors by a fraction you'd need cogitator assistance to calculate. How many psykers does this facility consume? None directly. We receive processed canopic material from regional tithe collection centers. Installation and maintenance occurs on schedules determined by Terra. I don't question the quotas. He made another adjustment, and the engine's pulse shifted frequency, moving up by an interval so subtle I could barely perceive it. The change propagated across the network. I felt it in my bones, in my teeth, in the hollow space where my neural implant used to process data. You felt that? The tech priest observed. The network marked you. You're synchronized permanently now. Every mirror installation, every resonance engine, every harmonic cradle in the solar system, you'll sense them all. Why would it mark me? Because you tried to kill it and failed. The network remembers failures. It catalogs everyone who attempted disruption and keeps them connected in case it needs to understand what went wrong. You're not being punished. You're being studied. He gestured toward a secondary display showing installation sites scattered across the Imperium, hundreds of them. Thousands. Every major world, every forge complex, every agri-processing center of sufficient scale hosted at least one node contributing fractional power to the distributed network, keeping the Emperor breathing. The infrastructure I'd discovered wasn't an exception. It was standard operating procedure, hidden in plain sight beneath layers of bureaucratic classification and theological misdirection. The throne doesn't sustain itself, the tech priest continued. It's sustained by 10,000 years of accumulated redundancy. Every power plant, every manufactorum, every void station drawing energy from local stars, they all feed back a percentage. Individually insignificant, collectively infinite. The Emperor breathes because the entire Imperium breathes for him, whether it knows or not. I left the chamber without responding, returned to my HAB unit, filed my audit report, with the 17% variance noted and explanation provided, distributed energy contribution to Mechanicus network operations, authorized under long-standing treaty agreements between the Administratum and Mars. The report was approved within hours. 2 months passed. I audited grain shipments and reconciled tithe percentages and lived the life of a functionary so thoroughly average that my personnel evaluations described me as meeting expectations without exceeding them. Safe. Invisible. Finished. Then the dreams started. Not nightmares exactly. More like involuntary data access. My sleeping mind connecting to the network through pathways that shouldn't exist in biology that had been stripped of augmetics. I saw mirrors activating across the solar system, Luna, Mars, Titan, locations I didn't recognize by name but understood by function. I felt psykers burning themselves out to maintain synchronization, their consciousness dissolving into the harmonic framework like sugar dissolving in water. I heard the Emperor's plea repeating across every frequency, that same desperate request for cessation that no one with the authority to grant it would acknowledge. Asterisk. Let me stop. Asterisk. I woke each morning remembering network operations I shouldn't be able to perceive. Capacitor discharge rates on Luna. Phase shift corrections at Titan. The installation of new canopic stacks at Mars's Noctis Labyrinthus ring. Technical data flooding into a mind that no longer possessed the hardware to process it properly, forcing meat-based neurons to do work they weren't designed for. The 6th month after Cipra Mundi, I received transfer orders to a forge world called Zhao Arcade. No explanation, no request for confirmation, just notification that my assignment had changed and transport had been arranged. The transfer was lateral, same rank, same responsibilities, same unremarkable career trajectory, leading nowhere. Zhao Arcad manufactured ship components, specializing in void shield generators and Geller field arrays. The forge complexes covered half a continent, their heat bloom visible from orbit as infrared signatures that turned the world's night side into a map of industrial concentration. I audited material inputs and energy consumption, tracking whether raw ore shipments matched production outputs within acceptable margins. The discrepancies appeared immediately. Zhao Arcad consumed 32% more psyker tithe material than its documented astropathic choir required. The excess was logged as research materials, with requisition codes that referenced projects I had no clearance to investigate. I followed the paper trail through archives so deeply nested in bureaucratic classification that accessing them took 3 weeks of routing requests through channels designed to discourage inquiry. The requisitions originated from a Magos biologist assigned to something called the Anima Protocol, a research initiative studying psychic resonance compatibility and methods for extending consciousness beyond individual biological hosts. The protocol's facility existed in Zhao Arcad's deep industrial sectors, buried beneath forge complexes and shielded by layers of security that made my audit credentials look like visitor passes. I shouldn't have been able to enter. The doors opened anyway, recognizing something about me that my documentation didn't explain. Inside, I found what looked like a cathedral crossed with a Medicae laboratory. Rows of suspension tanks holding human bodies, or what had been human bodies before augmentation transformed them into something else. Each tank connected to machines measuring psychic output and neural activity, monitoring consciousness that had been chemically sustained past the point where biological death should have occurred. A Magos biologist supervised the installation, her augmetic so extensive that humanity was a minority component in her current form. She noticed my arrival without looking up from her work, sensor arrays tracking my presence while her hands continued adjusting nutrient feeds to one of the tanks. "Auditor," she said, voice rendered mechanical by Vox augmentation. "You're earlier than projected models suggested. The network's influence on your behavior is accelerating." What is this place? Cognitive reservoir research. We're attempting to extend individual psychic potential by maintaining consciousness in artificial support structures after biological expiration. The throne proves it's possible. We're simply trying to replicate the methodology on smaller scales. She gestured at the tanks with a mechadendrite, indicating specific installations where monitoring equipment showed neural activity that exceeded normal human parameters. These were sanctioned psychers who volunteered for transition rather than terminal consumption. We keep them functional indefinitely, harvesting their psychic output for network contributions, while their consciousness explores spaces that bounded existence can't reach. Volunteered. The documentation was processed according to standard protocols. I approached one of the tanks and examined the body inside. Male, mid-40s before augmentation, now suspended in blue-tinted suspension fluid with cables penetrating skull and spine to extract whatever made him psychically sensitive. His eyes were open, moving in patterns that suggested some form of awareness, despite the fact that his brain had been partially replaced with cogitator architecture. The monitoring display showed his designation, Chore Unit 447, Theta. Below that, a name that records claimed had been voluntarily surrendered but which remained in the technical documentation. Marcus Ventrian, originally from Cadia, sanctioned at age 17, served in astropathic communications for 23 years before volunteering for transition to cognitive reservoir status. His psychic output fed directly into Zhao Arcad's resonance engine, a fractional contribution that combined with thousands of others to maintain one node in the distributed network, keeping the Emperor breathing. He wasn't dead. He wasn't alive. He existed in the space between, used in ways he'd never agreed to for purposes he'd never been told about. "How many installations like this exist?" I asked. "The protocol operates on 17 forge worlds. We process approximately 8,000 cognitive reservoirs annually across all sites. Efficiency is acceptable. Mortality during transition is declining as our procedures improve. 8,000 per year. For how many years? How many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people maintained in tanks, stripped of identity and agency, converted to components in machinery that sustained a network that sustained a god who begged to be released? I filed a report documenting the Anima Protocol and recommending investigation into whether the Cognitive Reservoir Program met the Administratum's ethical standards for psyker utilization. The report was classified immediately and buried under seals that suggested someone far above my rank had decided the information required containment rather than review. 3 days later, I received a visitor. He wore inquisitorial regalia, stripped of specific ordo identification, his rosette real but his authority deliberately vague. Young for his rank, perhaps 30, perhaps younger, augmentation making age difficult to estimate. He sat across from my desk in the cramped office I'd been assigned, and studied me with eyes that had been trained to read people the way I'd been trained to read ledgers. "Your reports are causing problems," he said without preamble or social niceties. "I document discrepancies. That's my function. Your function is whatever serves the Imperium's interests. Right now, those interests don't include exposing infrastructure that keeps humanity functional." He placed a data slate on my desk, screen displaying a map of the solar system with nodes marked at every location I'd discovered hosting mirror installations: Terra, Luna, Mars, Titan, Zhao Arcud, Cipra Mundi. Hundreds of others spreading outward toward the system's edge like a web with Terra at its center. "You thought you heard it," he said, tapping the slate screen where Terra pulsed with that familiar 88-minute rhythm. "You thought 8 heartbeats of darkness meant you'd succeeded in granting mercy. You were wrong. The network adapted. It rerouted. It distributed the load across more nodes and reduced the burden on Terra's primary frame by exactly the amount you'd attempted to collapse." He pulled up secondary data showing power consumption changes across the network following my attack. Every installation had increased its contribution by fractional percentages, spreading the deficit so thinly that no single location bore noticeable additional weight. The throne still breathed. The Emperor still suffered. But now the suffering was shared more equitably across machinery that spanned half the galaxy. "You made it more efficient," the Inquisitor continued. "You forced the system to acknowledge its own redundancy and actively leverage it. The Mechanicus has been studying your attack for months, using it as a stress test to identify vulnerabilities and implement improvements. You didn't wound the network. You helped it evolve." I stared at the data, watching pulses propagate from Terra outward in waves that touched every marked node. The rhythm was faster now, not 88 minutes, but 86. The tempo increased by whatever adjustments had been implemented following my failed attempt at mercy-killing a god. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to understand that resistance is futile, not through overwhelming force, but through overwhelming redundancy. The Imperium doesn't sustain itself through strength. It sustains itself through accumulated inertia. 10,000 years of infrastructure, built on systems that forgot their original purpose but kept functioning anyway. You can't kill it by attacking 1 point. You can't even kill it by attacking 1,000 points. It's too distributed, too entrenched, too fundamentally necessary for humanity's survival." He stood to leave, then paused at the door with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested he'd rehearsed this moment. "The Emperor wants to die. Everyone who gets close enough to hear him knows that. But what the Emperor wants stopped mattering the moment he became the system rather than the man operating it. We don't keep him alive because we're cruel. We keep him alive because letting him die would collapse the Astronomican, strand every ship in the warp, and end human civilization across 1,000,000 worlds. His suffering sustains our species. That's not theology, that's mathematics." He left. I deleted my report on the Anima Protocol and filed a revised audit concluding that Zhao Arcud's psyker consumption fell within acceptable parameters for a forge world of its production scale. The transfers continued. Every 6 months, new orders sending me to new worlds where I audited new systems and found new nodes in the network. Griffon 4th, Styges 8th, Agrippina, Metallica. Each world hosted mirror installations of varying scales. Each contributed fractional power to sustaining Terra's burden. Each maintained through bureaucratic processes so mundane that nobody questioned their existence. On Griffon IV, I discovered that the planet's entire industrial output was calibrated around sustaining its resonance engine. Every manufactorum, every forge, every power plant operated on schedules designed to maintain stable energy feeds to the mirror installation hidden beneath the world's primary hive. The population, billions of workers producing weapons and vehicles for the Imperium's endless wars, existed unknowingly as components in machinery that served a purpose they'd never been told about. On Styges VIII, I found evidence that the Mechanicus had been experimenting with consciousness transfer for centuries before the Anima Protocol formalized the practice. Archives documented early attempts dating back to M32, efforts to preserve dying tech priests by uploading their minds into cogitator matrices. The experiments had failed to maintain individual identity but succeeded in creating psychic resonance that could be harnessed for network stabilization. Failure had become foundation. Abandoned research had evolved into accepted practice. On Agrippina, I interviewed workers who'd served in astropathic choirs for decades, asking about their experiences with the tithe system and whether they understood what happened to psykers who exceeded their useful service life. None knew, none questioned. The system operated with such perfect opacity that people being consumed by it couldn't see the machinery that was eating them. I compiled documentation across 7 years of transfers. Thousands of pages detailing the network's scope, its methodology, its complete penetration of imperial infrastructure at every level. Evidence that the Emperor's suffering had been distributed so thoroughly across human space that stopping it would require simultaneously destroying every installation, every mirror, every resonance engine maintaining synchronization with Terra's primary frame. An impossible task. Not just difficult, literally impossible, given the resources available to any conceivable resistance movement. The network was too vast, too redundant, too deeply embedded in systems that humanity needed for survival. You couldn't attack it without attacking the Imperium itself, and attacking the Imperium meant condemning billions to death by starvation, war, and void madness as warp travel became impossible. The perfect trap. The Emperor's suffering sustained humanity's survival, and humanity's survival required the Emperor's suffering to continue. Anyone who understood the cycle was forced to participate in it or watch civilization collapse. There was no third option, no escape, no mercy. I stopped filing reports, stopped documenting discrepancies, stopped pretending that auditing numbers would change anything about the fundamental mathematics of how the Imperium sustained itself. I became what my personnel file had always claimed I was, a mid-level functionary performing routine work without asking questions that made his superiors uncomfortable. The dreams intensified. Every night, involuntary connection to the network, showing me its operations in detail, I couldn't escape. I saw psykers burning out in astropathic choirs across 100 worlds, watched cognitive reservoirs fail and get replaced without ceremony or acknowledgement, felt the Emperor's consciousness fragmenting further, pieces of his awareness splitting off and distributing themselves across the mirror network like a man drowning who grabs for anything that might provide flotation. Asterisk. Let me stop. Times had become. Times. Let us stop. Asterisk. A plea, spoken by whatever collective entity the Emperor had become, after 10,000 years of being processed through machinery that converted divinity into fuel. Not one voice anymore. Thousands of voices speaking in imperfect unison, fragments of consciousness scattered across infrastructure that spanned the galaxy. 20 years after my original investigation, I received final orders. Returned to Terra for reassignment to administrative positions within the Administratum's central archives. Promotion to Logister Second Class, with expanded access to historical records and senior-level documentation. Recognition for decades of loyal service performed without incident or complication. The promotion was a trap, obviously. They were bringing me back to the heart of the network where I could be monitored more directly, where my continued connection to the machinery could be studied and potentially exploited. I'd become a test subject, living proof that the network could mark individuals and maintain synchronization with them across decades and light years of separation. I accepted the promotion, boarded transport to Terra, Spent the 3-month journey watching the solar system grow closer through viewports that framed humanity's cradle as a jeweled sphere glowing with the accumulated light of 10,000 years of continuous habitation. Terra looked beautiful from space. Atmospheric haze softened the scars of continental-scale construction. Orbital platforms sparkled like stars made manifest. The palace, sprawled across visible geography, its golden spires catching sunlight and reflecting it back in ways that made the whole structure seem to glow with inner radiance. Underneath that beauty, cables descended into darkness, feeding a machine that consumed gods and called it acceptable procedure. My first assignment in the Central Archives was cataloging variance reports filed over the past century. Thousands of documents describing discrepancies that junior auditors had noticed and senior administrators had dismissed, buried, or classified. Evidence that hundreds of people across decades had seen glimpses of the network's operations and tried to bring attention to anomalies they couldn't fully explain. Every report had been processed according to standard protocols. Every auditor who'd filed concerning documentation had been transferred to positions where their clearances limited what they could investigate. Every thread that might have unraveled the secret had been cut and tucked back into the machinery that sustained itself through perfect bureaucratic opacity. I found my own original variance report in the archives, the notation about 88-minute pulses that didn't correspond to documented systems. Someone had appended a note to my file. Auditor demonstrated concerning initiative. Recommend reassignment to field operations where direct supervision can maintain operational security. Monitor for future irregularities. They'd been watching me since the beginning. My entire career, the transfers, the discoveries, the apparent freedom to investigate mirror installations across multiple worlds, all of it had been managed, guided, permitted because my continued connection to the network provided data about how it marked and tracked individuals who'd attempted disruption. I was a test subject who'd been convinced he was an investigator. A rat running a maze who'd believed he was mapping it while the researchers documented which paths he chose and how. Quickly he learned to avoid the ones that delivered shocks. The realization should have been crushing, should have broken whatever determination remained after 20 years of witnessing suffering. I couldn't prevent or alleviate. Should have finished the process that had started when I'd first noticed those 88-minute pulses and followed them into machinery that shouldn't exist. Instead, I felt something close to relief. Understanding your own helplessness is its own kind of freedom. Once you accept that changing the system is impossible, you're released from the obligation to keep trying. You can stop fighting, stop resisting. Stop pretending that individual action matters against forces that operate on geological timescales and galactic geography. You can just exist. Perform your assigned function. Maintain the machinery that maintains the suffering that maintains humanity's survival. Accept your role as a component in something too vast to comprehend fully and too necessary to abandon. I catalog variance reports. Filed documentation according to proper protocols. Lived in a hab unit 3 levels above my original workspace where I'd started this investigation 20 years earlier. Every 86 minutes, I felt the pulse beating through Terra's foundations, that rhythm faster now than it had been before my failed attempt at mercy. The network had adapted, had evolved, had become more efficient at distributing suffering across its infrastructure. My attack had made it stronger, more resilient, better equipped to sustain itself indefinitely, regardless of what individuals might attempt. The Emperor was still dying, would always be dying. His death extended across 10,000 years and counting. His consciousness fragmented across machinery that converted his suffering into the light that guided humanity through darkness. And I was part of that machinery now. Not a saboteur, not a resistance operative, not an auditor documenting crimes or conspiracies. Just another component, synchronized to the network's rhythm, performing my assigned function within systems that predated my birth and would continue operating long after my death. That's the truth that finishes its witnesses. Understanding that the Emperor's suffering isn't a problem to be solved, but a condition to be maintained. That mercy would mean extinction. That the most compassionate act is continuing to participate in cruelty because the alternative is apocalypse. You learn that truth, and it kills everything in you that believed change was possible. It finishes the person who thought investigation mattered, who imagined that exposing secrets would force authorities to act, who hoped that righteousness would overcome institutional inertia. What remains is a functionary who counts numbers and files reports and lives each day in the shadow of suffering he can't prevent, and won't attempt to end again because he knows, with the certainty that only comes from direct experience, that trying only makes things worse. The Emperor wants to die. The network keeps him alive. Humanity survives because of suffering it refuses to acknowledge. And I catalog variance reports in archives nobody reads, carrying the weight of knowing exactly what the numbers represent and exactly why they'll never change. That's the doomed life. That's what it means to be finished. Not destroyed, but completed, transformed into exactly what the Imperium needs you to be through the process of learning what the Imperium truly is. Every 86 minutes, the pulse. Every day, the work. Every year, the slow accumulation of documentation that records everything and changes nothing. The Emperor is still dying. I'm still counting. And somewhere in the network's distributed consciousness, fragments of divine awareness continue pleading for cessation, that no one with authority to grant it will ever acknowledge. Because the truth that finishes its witnesses is this. We heard the plea. We understood what it asked for. And we chose to keep the machinery running anyway, because survival requires sacrifice, and the greatest sacrifice is the one that never ends. That's mercy in the Imperium, that's love, that's duty. Making someone suffer forever so that billions might live, and never, ever admitting that we had a choice.